I'm here today with you on Friday afternoon, another Facebook Live. And this week, my talk with you is going to be about the concept of what is it like being an immigrant psychologist in Australia. My name is Pejman. I am a clinical psychologist. I'm Iranian Australian psychologist practicing here in Australia. And in general, my aim on this page is to increase people's awareness of mental health issues and provide kind of general knowledge regarding the psychological concepts that general public might be interested in. So that's my mission, and I try to increase mental well-being of people and increase educational concept on this issue. I know a lot of you will be watching this video later, and I hope if you're watching it over the weekend, you're going to end up having a very nice weekend. So I'll start with the topic of immigration and psychology, and I will be coming a lot of times from the personal perspective of what these experiences have been like here for me. And then I'll try to share with you guys, with my Australian audience and international audience, and I'll try to provide you with some feedback. I think that a bit of context here is important because I moved to Australia in 2006 and I had done my undergraduate studies in Iran, where I'm originally from. And I started practicing in Australia from year 2007 as an intern psychologist. Um, Through the years, after the first few years and graduating in 2009, the majority of clients that I was working with were from Australian background or international background. A few years later, I started to see a lot of Iranian patients who were coming into my private practice. And that started to create a very interesting experience to start to observe some form of pattern of presentation. When I was working with my Iranian clients, I often saw that sometimes they complained their presenting problems were quite similar in some cases amongst men and women, and there were these patterns that sometimes you were able to predict how they're going to show up or what symptoms they might show, which it was really intriguing, and it really got me to think about the general challenges that Iranians face when they migrate to Australia. And I started to kind of do a lot of work on that and do talks about that and try to provide trainings or workshops for general public to be able to integrate and adapt and integrate to the Australian culture and kind of try to fit in and try to have an experience in which they feel part of. And being Iranian myself and speaking the language, of course, that was possible. It was a fascinating experience to try to decode what's it like to become part of the Australian culture and what type of problems generally we face as immigrants when we move to the culture here. And of course, I have to be careful here because when speaking about Iranians, I will be generalizing here. And this is not going to be, of course, the same experience for all Iranians. But being an Iranian, I can probably be discriminative against Iranians. So, of course, I'm joking here. But I wanted to point out, I'm generalizing here. So don't take these things in a black and white way. But I think they kind of point out to the general pattern. So the first thing that I observed when I was trying to help Iranian to adjust and adapt to the culture here was, looking into the differences, um, was the primary issue was how some of the basic humanistic principles in Australia within the society are completely internalized by general public. Whilst in my culture, that has not necessarily taken place. So in my culture, there are a lot of kind of traditions and a lot of different ways that we do things, referring to as the culture, and is essentially the way that things were done in the past. And those principles are not necessarily compatible a lot of times with basic principles of humanism that is the foundation of the culture and society in Australia. So Here in Australia, understandably, we have so much emphasis on individual choices, on individuality. We are an individualistic culture, while we can say that Iranian culture might be more of a collectivist one. So we, as an Iranians, we might look more into what behaviors suit the whole better, what behaviors, how our actions and behaviors may be perceived by others. So we may put more weight and more emphasis on how we are being perceived by others as a collectivist culture compared to the Australian one that is kind of more emphasis on what you want to pursue, what brings happiness to you, and things like that. So there's an emphasis on the individualistic versus kind of collective aspects of the culture. But I think more importantly is that the institutions here have internalized for people their basic human rights at a deeper level. So this tends to show itself as a problem, for example, when we are kind of looking into the comparisons of different genders, and we may observe that sometimes for some Iranian women when moving to Australia, it might be a bit confusing in regards to the rights and in regards to what is accepted and what is the norm. So here, through the process of culturalization at university, education at school, at very kind of younger age at school, we teach equality to both genders as an internalized concept. For good reasons, we try to drill it in as much as we can. Boys, girls, completely the same. Most of the times go to the same school, involved in the same activities. It's if you start to separate them, you have to have a very good rationale for it, or otherwise you're discriminating against gender. So we culturally are so sensitive surrounding these concepts in Australia for a very good cause. Well, in my culture, that was not really the case. So a lot of times, for example, and I'm again stereotyping here, but when an Iranian lady might move to Australia with her husband, they might not exactly know where the lines are. Where is it and what is expected from her as a person being within a relationship with another person? When are her rights being violated by her partner? In Australia, might be more clarity over that. Now, of course, I'm not naive here. In Australia, we have massive problems with domestic violence. We have a lot of problems with inequality. There are a lot of problems within the structure of society, but those foundational concepts, relatively speaking, are more internalized by the general public. So for people from my country, when they move here, I think as the host culture to make them feel more welcomed and to assist the process of immigration, we may benefit from completely breaking down these differences and providing the opportunity for people to compare and contrast their experience and their rights in terms of what it was like back then and now what are the new sets of rules, and make sure that the reasons behind those sets of rules are completely explained. Otherwise, it might be confusing, it might seem over the top. So I think there is a process within the immigration that it might really benefit from clarifying these differences in a very tangible way for people who move here and may struggle with these rules and laws. I think that can definitely be a kind of source of comfort, both for the host culture and for the people who are migrating here. A lot of my conversations with my fellow Iranians could end up on some of the concepts that we might consider them basic but fundamental concepts here, such as equality of rights, such as the kind of right of children. So these are areas that might appear a bit like gray areas, and I think it's definitely there's some room to clarify it further for people who move here, because a lot of times I noticed this time as an Australian that our assumption is that people get these concepts. Our assumption is that of course people understand these things because to us it seems common sense. However, that is not necessarily the case. And I think in general, our institutions may benefit more from not making these assumptions and making sure that we explore these concepts more systematically for people who enter here. I'm not sure in terms of policy making, how is this going to be carried out, but as a concept, as a psychologist who has migrated here, I've really noticed the contrast there of how the basic principles of humanism are completely internalized and understood here by the general public. Of course, it's not perfect, but it's noticeably different. Another part that I think is very important to emphasize is in no way am I saying that people are fundamentally different. One of my very interesting observations here has been that when I go shopping, early days I would have noticed a lot more. Um, when I would go shopping or when I was kind of in different places, and interacting with people for me was so interesting how each person might be very patient in Australia. It's kind of less populated, things are less intense, people respect the boundaries and the distance and all of that. But after the the whole anxiety with the COVID-19 and with the corona started to go really high within Australia, and we started to feel pressured, and we started to feel some of the anxiety that a lot of my kind of fellow Iranians might experience on a daily basis in Iran. We started to notice that as calm and collected Australians, we started to get into punch-ups in Woolies over toilet rolls. So I think there is a case here to be made for us as Australians to not be arrogant, to not be full of ourselves and consider ourselves in any way better than, or God forbid, more civilized or anything like that. We just have had more access to resources, which has allowed us to create institutions that has brought up the best part of mankind as the general rules and the structure that is running the society. And whenever we feel nervous, whenever we feel under stress, we are all just as mad as one another under enough amount of stress. So I think it's a point to be made, and I wanted to emphasize on that. The other area that I wanted to go to is, so far I've been talking about these cultural differences and how a lot of my training and workshops with fellow Iranians have been on allowing them to recognize these differences. But I feel at the same time, I might have something to add here for my fellow Australians. I think that being an immigrant, you find a unique perspective on some of the weirdness of the Australian culture that you guys might not be aware of because it comes across as normal to you. So, of course, this is what you've lived your life with. So it really appears to be normal for you how you're living, but it is quite absurd. And there are a few of those points. And I'm kind of tempted to talk about all of them at once, but it's probably better to break them down. And I'm going to break them down into a number of stories, and I'm going to present them to you over some of the lives that I'm going to do over the next few weeks. So in the next few weeks, I'll be speaking as an immigrant psychologist, as an Iranian immigrant psychologist who've been helping Iranians to adjust to the Australian culture. But as I've been doing that, I noticed and said, oh, wait a minute. The Australian side, within how we do things, there is a lot of weirdness and there are a lot of problems that because the majority of us have grown up with them, we have happened to become blind to them. And I think it kind of might be worthy for us to maybe at least speak about one of those stories here today. I just share one, and then I'll tell you more stories about this later. I think it was after 8 or 9 years of immigrating to Australia, I felt like, okay, I got my permanent residency, I got my citizenship, I've married to the Australian culture, I'm part of this culture. It's time for me as a Queenslander to watch State of Origin. And that was such an interesting experience. I watched it, and I was working in drug and alcohol sector at that time. And it was such a surreal experience observing this because, the first team came on, and I saw on their shirt it's written VB, Victorian Beer. These are the kind of children's heroes walking up. And then the other team comes up, 4X Beer. So both teams are coming to the field. wearing shirts that is been sponsored by different beer companies. Throughout the game, they were these gambling ads that were coming up all the time. As soon as the game finished, I saw some of the players opening cans of beer in the field. These are heroes of the kids that are watching the game with their fathers, looking at their heroes. And they are tough, they are strong, they are agile. These are what these kids want to be. Before they're wearing a t-shirt, all sponsored by different alcohol companies, beer companies. They open the beer on the field. Completely, we're creating an association with drinking, with gambling, and kind of other masculine cultures of strength and power and ability. Now, I'm not a straight guy here. I'm not kind of saying, oh, beer is bad, we shouldn't drink, we shouldn't gamble. But I think this is really, really weird. These are the moments that every young boy or girl will sit with his dad or mom watching their heroes. And it was just unbelievable working in drug and alcohol to observe that everything was around the culture of drinking and gambling as we were watching a sporting event. Now, I get it. We are used to this stuff now. We are Australians, and that's what we do. But I think that's a perspective that sometimes being an immigrant, I was working in drug and alcohol at that time. And I remember I turned to my wife and I'm like, is this for real? Like this feels so surreal to me. We spend so many resources in the future on mental health, on trying to help people, on trying to assist them. As a culture, we emphasize so much, the concepts of happiness and mental health and issues like that. And we know drug and alcohol are such a big problem in our society. And during the state of origin, both teams are representing different alcohol companies, and we're showing gambling ads in between. I just could not believe my eyes. And as I was talking about that, as I have spoken of that over the years with my Aussie friends, everyone acknowledges it, but everyone is like, oh yeah, like I haven't thought about that before. I kind of get a sense like growing up here, we might become a bit numb to some of the absurdities that when someone as an immigrant comes here and starts working with us, might get that perspective. And I have taken on as part of my mission to be able to highlight those things. Of course, there's no judgment there, but we got to think about it and kind of realize, is this really the things that we want to demonstrate, like as behaviors or as tendencies that we want to have in our society, in such a kind of high scale, when we're facing such problems, should we not reflect back and think, are we contributing to the creating of this problem with the gambling, with the drinking, by emphasizing on the culture in sporting events like rugby, that a lot of boys who want to be tough, who want to be strong, might be following it, and we're creating a direct association between beer drinking and sport performance and being celebrated by others. I thought that was one of the absurd things that I observed as an immigrant psychologist, and being Iranian Australian. I wanted to share this story with you. Believe me, I got 3, 4 more, and I think they're interesting stuff. I will keep you updated with them. I want to thank you for watching this video, and I hope you're going to have a wonderful weekend, and I'll see you next time. Have a good one.